Now, you may notice that I've gone ahead and changed to a different image here, just for the sake of variety. It has nothing to do with the topic of this exercise, which is preference settings. Now, we're not going to be talking about all the preference settings. That would take us forever, and it would be hideously dull. We're just going to talk about the settings that I think are set wrong by default, as well as those that you might want to change on occasion. All right, so to get to the Preferences command, you already know this. We're going to go to the Edit menu, choose Preferences, and then choose General. On the Macintosh side, you would go to the Photoshop menu, then choose Preferences, then choose General. Even easier, press Control-K here on the PC or Command-K on the Mac to bring up the big old Preferences dialog box. The first thing I want you to turn off, turn it the heck off, in fact, is this Export Clipboard checkbox. It has no business being on. It's been on since the dawn of time by default inside of Photoshop. Highly irritating because it can mess things up. It will actually slow down your system. Unless you know for a fact that you want to copy things from Photoshop and then turn around and paste them into a totally different application, turn this checkbox off because you can copy just ginormous images inside of Photoshop. And while that works inside Photoshop, as soon as you go to a different application, as soon as you switch, even back just to the desktop, then Photoshop has to transfer the contents of the clipboard to the system clipboard. That takes forever. It often fails. It's just a big, giant pain in the neck. And people don't work this way. You don't copy things from Photoshop and paste them into other applications. 99% of the time, that's not the way you work. All right, so point made, turn it off. Another one I recommend you turn off, this isn't such a big deal, is this guy right here. Use Shift key for tool switch. When that's on, you have to press, for example, Shift-M to switch between the two marquee tools. I prefer to just press M by itself, M as in M&Ms, by itself to switch between the two marquees. And that's what I'm assuming you're going to do too throughout this whole series. So go ahead and turn this checkbox off just to make sure that you and I are on the same page. Now, the next panel is this panel called Interface. It's new to Photoshop CS3. It's not terribly interesting, though. We'll come back to it later when I show you a couple of options. But for now, I want you to skip on to File Handling, which is terribly interesting, if only because this guy right here, in my estimation, is set wrong. Basically, what's happening here is there's this option, of course, called Maximize PSD and PSB file compatibility. And if you turn on Maximize Compatibility, then whenever you save a layered PSD document, Photoshop goes ahead and saves a flattened version of the image along with, which grows the file, making it half again as large in many cases without any upside. It doesn't do you any good unless you are planning on taking layered PSD files and importing them into the likes of Adobe Premiere or Adobe InDesign. Then you don't want this turned on. So go ahead and change this to never. Again, if you're just using your layered PSD files inside Photoshop, set this option to never. Version queue, unless you're working in a version queue environment, turn this option off. It will speed things up ever so slightly, and it'll just prevent you from having any version queue nuisances, as it turns out. Now switch over to performance, if you would. Make sure that this memory usage option is hovering around 50%. It doesn't have to be exactly 55 or 50% or any of those numbers, but you don't want it set too high. If you end up turning this up, you'll give Photoshop more memory, but you'll take memory away from other applications as well as away from the system, and that can create a lot of problems. So I recommend, if anything, you turn it down if you have a very high memory system, like you have 3 gigs of RAM. Then you might be able to turn this down a little bit to something in the neighborhood of 40%. Otherwise, if you just have, your standard 1 gig of RAM or so, then go ahead and leave it set to its default, which in my case is 55%. If you have multiple hard drives, you should set up one of those other hard drives as a scratch disk. Go ahead, in my case, I've got a D drive, a big D drive, as you can see. I'm going to go ahead and turn on that D drive, and I'm going to click on that D drive and move it to the top of the list so that I'm first going to the D drive and then secondly going to the drive that contains Photoshop, that has the PS startup item here. That way, Photoshop is going to run more quickly when it runs out of RAM and has to start hitting the disk, which happens pretty regularly, actually, as it turns out, even if you have a ton of RAM. Now I'm going to go to the cursors item. The only thing I change here is I like to turn on Show Crosshair in Brush Tip so that you have a little crosshair showing you the center of your paintbrush. That's it there. Now I switch ahead. Forget about transparency and gamut. You don't need to bother with that. Go to units and rulers because this you do need to bother with. I do not recommend you work with inches or anything else for that matter, centimeters, millimeters, any of these guys. I recommend you work in pixels so that you're actually specifying the size of your document in pixels, because everything inside Photoshop to this day is still all about pixels. It's a pixel editing program, and pixels is going to give you the most control. And basically, guys, that's it. The rest of the stuff you don't need to bother with right now. You can look at it later on your own time if you want to. Those are the items I suggest you change. Once you've done it, go ahead and click OK. And you and I are now on the same page, ready to fulfill our mission of learning Photoshop throughout the rest of this glorious series.